Dayton. We all know the icons from the city's history. People like the Wright brothers, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Charles Kettering, and John Patterson. Well, this show isn't about any of them. Instead of talking about those who made history, let's take a look at those who lived it in this place called Dayton. If you remember the dining room in Reich's, if you ever rode a streetcar or trolley bus when the fare was just a few pennies, or if you sang along with Kenny Rogers, the Jumpin' Cowboy, stick around, for these are your memories of Dayton. It's a rainy Saturday afternoon in October. The year, 1949. The place, downtown Dayton. The streets are lined with spectators witnessing the annual University of Dayton Homecoming Parade. If you lived or grew up in Dayton during the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, this is how you remember the city. Do you see the old familiar places? For so many, this is the Dayton of the good old days. To be sure, the community had its difficulties, what with the Depression, wartime restrictions, and later the immense growing pains of the 50s. But maybe what makes us fondly recall those times of not so long ago is how life was simpler. For these were the days when Dayton seemed to be a small town and not a large city.
I guess that's what I miss, that closeness, that people had that friendliness, the sort of easiness of the times. There wasn't that stressed, hurry up, busy type of atmosphere. Everybody just kind of strolled along, did their thing, and I think that's what I miss the most.
While life was certainly slower in days gone by, it's also striking how different Dayton looked when compared to today. There are so many landmarks that made an impact on our lives. Many have nearly been forgotten. Do you remember? Fast food hadn't been invented. There was only good food in quaint little cafes. One of the biggest bottlenecks in town was at the Monument. Perhaps you recall when the Newsboys' picnic would shut down traffic in front of the Daily News building. Or maybe you helped earn one of those cherished wartime E-flags at Frigidaire, Delco, or NCR. Yes, life in Dayton has changed a great deal since the 1950s. In those days, before high-tech this and that, it didn't take much to be entertained, and we seemed to be happier for it. We were a much closer community. Dayton's suburbs hadn't yet blossomed. And when we wanted for something, everyone knew where to find it. And that was downtown. Downtown. For generations of Daytonians, the very word was magic. In this rare film shot in May of 1948, downtown is shown at its zenith. The sidewalks are jammed with shoppers, office workers, and busy executives. The streets are crammed with cars and trolley buses. If this was the city you grew up in, it was indeed a special place.
As soon as the trolley car took me down or turned on the main street toward Dayton, it was like entering the land of Oz. Like Dorothy when she opened up the door and everything became colorful and so forth. That's the way it was with me. It was just another world. I could forget all this, my humdrum existence in Edgemont, and just be fascinated by the wonders.
Unless you worked or had business downtown, you most likely traveled here for shopping, or perhaps to see a movie. A visit to Dayton wasn't complete without a stop at Reich's at the corner of 2nd and Main. Maybe you had lunch in a very busy and crowded dining room.
That place was so busy you couldn't get in it. It was really, you go in there, be a line for coming and going each way to get in and out. It was real busy.
3rd and Main. Has there ever been a place in Dayton that's been more photographed? 3rd and Main has been, still is, and probably always will be the heart of the city. Everything at 3rd and Main can change, except for Dayton's glorious courthouse. Chances are it will still be here 1,000 years from now, right there on the northwest corner. You've heard the old saying, if the walls could talk? Well, Dayton's old courthouse could most likely tell endless stories. It was constructed in 1850 as one of the finest examples of Greek revival architecture in this country. In almost a century and a half of existence, the corner of 3rd and Main and the courthouse steps have been jammed with spectators countless times, gathered together to listen to Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Richard Nixon. This list goes on and on. As the center of the community, it's also had its share of oddities. How else can we explain the world's largest cash register? For decades, Dayton's old courthouse has been ringed with bus stops and benches, a perfect place to watch the world go by, even for young people with dreams and imaginations.
We used to go downtown. We would get on the bus on Saturdays and go downtown. And one of my favorite things I used to do, it was sit on they had these benches down like on 3rd and Main on the corner, and down on practically every corner there was these little benches you could sit on. And we would just sit on the benches and just watch the people go by. And we would play games like, well, what did this person do, and what kind of occupation, and we'd make up little stories about the people as they were going by. And this could go on for hours.
Of course, it's been many, many years since Dayton's old courthouse has actually been a courthouse. Yet there's little chance it will disappear like so many other landmarks. This place is Dayton, and there's something very comforting about that. How do we describe downtown Dayton's Grand Arcade? Even though its doors are closed, it's all dressed up for the holidays, the remnants of a temporary opening several years ago. To look around it today, you realize it's still a happy place, beckoning all of us to remember our own special arcade story. At one time, this is what it looked like underneath the arcade's dome, a massive open market area. Many would travel here on Saturdays to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. There were lunch counters and soda fountains. For more than 50 years, a cheese shop served hundreds of customers a day. In another corner stood the arcade fish market. It's still there, with its checkered tile. And then there was the smell of fresh popcorn.
There was a lady in the arcade, and she sold popcorn. Everybody in the city knew her as Mary. Her name was Mary Perkins.
You could never get any that taste like it now because they made it with real butter. It just tastes. My memory of it is the best popcorn there ever was. Yep.
Meet you in the arcade was perhaps the most frequently heard phrase on Dayton streets. Whether it was a destination, an easy shortcut from 3rd to 4th Street, or even a meeting point, the arcade was sure to have many visitors every day.
It was just bustling with people and smells and sounds, and well, it was the place to go for shopping, and you had the farmer's market outside and behind it, so that's where everyone came to shop on Saturday morning.
Dayton's Grand Arcade has aged gracefully and well. To look at it now, one can almost picture it being filled once again with shops and an open market, with sweet smells and the sound of laughter and happiness drifting about underneath the dome. It's a place filled with memories. Might there be more arcade memories for a future generation? If you love movies, then there was once a time when Dayton was paradise. Many downtown cinemas actually had their starts as either vaudeville theaters or as opera houses. In fact, today's Victoria Theater actually had its start as Dayton's Grand Opera House. That it's the lone survivor among the golden days of cinema and theater is stunning. The Victoria first opened its doors in 1866. It wouldn't last long. Fire destroyed Dayton's Opera House in May of 1869. It was rebuilt and opened again on Thanksgiving Day of 1871. The Victoria may have been built for opera, but it was traveling minstrel shows and exhibitions such as Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show that packed them in. In 1904, the Victoria hosted one of the biggest stage events ever held in Dayton, the production of Ben-Hur. There was a cast and crew of 350. Real horses ran on treadmills on the Victoria stage to simulate the famous chariot race. The Victoria allowed Dayton to draw some of the biggest performers and speakers of the era: Mark Twain, Horace Greeley, and Harry Houdini. The Victoria suffered again, with its interior extensively damaged during the 1913 flood. Once again, it was repaired and reopened, this time in 1919, and with a new name, the Victory, an honor to World War I veterans. It was during this era when the Victory began to show motion pictures. It would become just one of the many cinemas that would open along Dayton streets in the first few decades of the 20th century. Among the others was another former opera house, the Mayfair on 5th Street. In later years, the Mayfair Theater became famous, some might say infamous, for its burlesque shows. Curiously, today no one will admit to ever patronizing the Mayfair, even though it stayed open into the 60s. And there were many others. In fact, depending on who was counting, downtown Dayton once had no fewer than 9 movie houses. Some were regal and elegant.
They were decorated like the classical theaters that you would like to see. I think the Victory was my favorite because of the chandeliers and the lights, and you had the rich dark colors in the carpet, and the seats were nice and cushiony. And movie theaters now are just blah compared to the way they were then.
Each downtown movie palace had its own special niche and personality. The Columbia on Jefferson had a huge arch and a flag of lights topping off its exterior. For just 15 cents, it was the place to catch Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, and other cowboy serials.
The way it was designed and all on the outside, more than the inside, led one to believe that with the right color, paint, and the dressing up and all, it could really be quite a classy little theater.
Around the corner on 4th Street was the State, with aging gray stone and a brooding exterior. It was seemingly perfect for Frankenstein and the Wolfman.
Oh, the State. Oh, the State. I almost get tears in my eyes when I think of the State. Basically, the personality is that of an old castle. You might have even said when you looked at the outside in those days that it belonged to Count Dracula. So naturally, what would be more appropriate to show there than these old horror flicks, you know, flickering black and white.
If Dayton's theaters were royalty, then it had 2 competing queens. One was Lowe's on Main. It often featured many of the great MGM musicals of a generation ago, and its unique interior with the hole in the ceiling was fascinating, at least to some.
I was more interested in the architecture on the inside than I was in the movie. All I could do was wonder what in the world that big hole was doing up there in the ceiling behind me, you know? That was a mezzanine that led up to the 2nd floor. So it was a beautiful place.
Lowe's was the site of one of Dayton's biggest events of 1944, an appearance by an adolescent Shirley Temple for the premiere of her movie, the now forgotten Since You Went Away. Were you in the crowd in front of Lowe's?
My mother took my sister and I both to see her, all of her pictures. We loved them. And then when I found out she was going to be in town for the premiere, I went to see it. And I also got an autographed copy of the book by her too, so that was a real plus for me. I liked her a lot.
At the corner of 4th and Ludlow stood Dayton's other royal lady, Keith's Theater. It started as Dayton's premier vaudeville house. To put it simply, it was huge, seating more than 2,700, and magnificent.
You were Alice in Wonderland, that's all I can say. It was a beautiful place. The most sophisticated, elegant place you could ever imagine. And of course it was built in 1922. That was at a time when, well, when movie theaters were made as palaces, you might say.
As movie theaters began to filter into the suburbs, and Americans found entertainment at home, the popularity of catching a movie downtown began to fade. The palaces have disappeared, but their spirit is never too far away. The next time you see an old black and white film on TV, try to remember where it was you saw it first, and smile. It's a blazing hot summer in Dayton. If you were a child in the 50s, you knew where to find relief. Dayton had its share of public swimming pools, and with a couple of coins in your pocket, you could have an entire day of fun. Of course, there was the Eastwood Pool on Springfield Street. At one time, a nickel was the day-long admission fee. The Baumberger Pool on East 5th Street was known for its unique design, resembling some sort of Roman or Grecian bath. Its admission, a penny for a half-hour swim, a dime in the evening. And then there was the one major private pool in the city, although it may have had the highest attendance of them all. The pool at Old River was built in the 1930s by National Cash Register for the use of its employees and their families. Old River was actually more than just a pool. Stretching over 120 acres, Old River had picnic facilities, ball fields, and its setting on a lagoon made boating and canoeing a popular pastime. But most of the attention was focused around the gigantic pool. It was fed by water from the river, and some still swear today that the Old River Pool had the coldest water they ever swam in. For young families and kids, Old River offered an ideal getaway that didn't break the family budget. While Old River was just one of the many benefits NCR extended to its employees, it also gave to the community. One of its gifts to Dayton was a stately old building on South Main Street that touched the lives of nearly every resident. Construction on the NCR Auditorium started in 1911. The building was designed by the New York architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and Wright. You may recognize the third partner as famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright. The building took just a year to build and was originally called the NCR Hall of Industrial Education. It was enlarged in 1914, and the 6 familiar Grecian columns were added. Another expansion followed in 1922, when its seating capacity was increased to more than 2,200. In its early years, the facility was often used for company sales seminars. We can only guess what was being said in these motivational skits. In 1932, it was decided that Hall of Industrial Education was a bit heavy, so the building was renamed the NCR Schoolhouse. But this didn't exactly fit either. So 6 years later, it would undergo its final name change, becoming the now famous NCR Auditorium. During the next 4 decades, the auditorium would become one of the most recognizable and highly used structures in Dayton. In just a bit, we'll take a stroll down Main Street for Saturday morning movies, and we'll line up for graduation ceremonies. Please stay with us for Memories of Dayton. Even today, the pictures of the NCR auditorium show a structure that seemed forbidding, but for several generations of Dayton children, it was one of the friendliest places in town. From the 1920s until the 60s, Saturday mornings found the auditorium filled with kids. Officially called children's meetings, they were open free of charge to all boys and girls in the Dayton area. Imagine, if you can, an auditorium filled with more than 2,000 kids, jammed in to watch cartoons, talent contests, and movies. And you'll have a good idea of what Saturdays were like in the auditorium.
Always fun, always fun. Never any fights, never any color lines. We just all sort of melted together and no problems.
You would go to the movie, and then when you came out, they would give you a candy bar. My girlfriend and I would go every Saturday morning to the NCR to see the movie and get our candy bar.
They would pass out song sheets to the people with the lyrics on there. So even if you didn't know how the melody went, you were expected to sing along. And boy, I can tell you, but there were some strange sounds there I can remember.
Christmas was a unique time for the Saturday morning movies. An extra special treat was handed out after the show, and there was always an appearance by the jolly old elf. The holiday program was incredibly popular and necessitated extra shows. One year, more than 7,000 kids showed up to see the Christmas show.
Right after Thanksgiving, we knew these movies were going to come during Christmas time, and we would look forward to that. I mean, we'd think about it and could hardly wait. We had a chance to go down there on Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon, see the movie and get our little present. I mean, we look forward to that.
The auditorium might be best remembered as the site of high school graduations. Starting in 1924, nearly every Dayton high school held commencement ceremonies at NCR. During a span of 53 years, organist Robert Klein played Pomp and Circumstance as an estimated 400,000 local residents walked across the auditorium stage to receive a diploma.
Oh, he could make that organ talk. Believe me, he was good. I really enjoyed that.
By the late 1970s, the aging auditorium was becoming incredibly expensive to maintain. After attempts to find a suitable caretaker for the building failed, it was very reluctantly torn down in 1980. In 72 years of existence, the NCR Auditorium hosted community meetings, television shows, civic rallies, and countless other events. Its site on South Main is now an open field. Next time you drive past, take a moment to reflect and remember the precious old friend from our past, and recall just what it might have meant to you. In Dayton, this has happened before. The arrival of new trolley buses rings in the latest chapter in the city's mass transit history. For more than a century, Daytonians have used electric transportation to travel about town. Streetcars and trolleys have been an integral thread in the fabric of the community. It's perhaps only now that we realize how fortunate we are to still have them navigating our streets. It's May of 1870. These are Dayton's first streetcars. Mules and horses pulled tiny cars along track laid on several of Dayton's main streets. Animal-powered cars were used until the summer of 1888. It was then that the first electric wires were strung above the city's streets. Daytonians fell in love with electric transit. Packed cars convinced other entrepreneurs to get into the business. It led to the complicated tangle of wires above Main Street, where up to half a dozen different lines converged.
Oh, at one time, each company had its own wire. Although they shared the track, each company had their own separate power or trolley wire. And woe be unto the motorman that put his pole on the other company's wire. And at one time, there was at least 4 sets of wires on each side of the street.
Dayton's many streetcar companies didn't actually compete against one another. Rather, each one served a different part of the community, with all of their lines meeting downtown. Also, on Dayton streets during the first few decades of this century were larger cars called interurbans. These large, fast cars would carry passengers from city to city. In Dayton, it was possible to board an interurban bound for Cincinnati, Columbus, or even Indianapolis. When cruising across open rural areas, the big electric cars, which some called tractions, could hit speeds of 90 miles an hour. If only they were still running today. The interurbans and streetcars were amazing creatures. For an entire generation, they opened up an enormous world. Farm children who would have seldom ventured past their property lines could now travel quickly and cheaply to far-off places. And city kids who knew little beyond their own neighborhood began to discover all the undiscovered places of their hometowns. The sound of steel wheels on rails was nothing short of a love song.
The first thing I remember as a real young boy, when the streetcar went down the street, you'd see a spark come out of the trolley wheel at every span wire, and that was the great fascination. What caused that spark? And I guess in some way that may have led me to become an electrical engineer. But the streetcar was, it opened up the world to you. It was the only way to get away from your neighborhood, because we had no cars in those early 1930s when I was growing up.
There are many in Dayton who can still recall all of the streetcar routes, how long it took to get from place to place, what their gentle roll felt like, and how much the fare was when you remembered to pay.
It was 3 cents for me and 5 cents for my mother. She gave me the 8 cents and I would get on. And when we would get off, I'd say, "Oh, Mommy, I still got the 8 cents. So we'd ride back home on that same 8 cents.
Despite their reliability and the thousands of riders who depended on them, streetcars did have their drawbacks. They couldn't pick up passengers at the curb. Their track made street repairs difficult, and if you ask those who lived along a streetcar line, they'll remember that they were indeed noisy. When Indianapolis made a purchase of a newfangled contraption called the trolley bus, officials from Dayton's streetcar companies were keenly interested. It appeared that it could be a solution to an aging streetcar fleet.
Well, in the later days, most streetcar companies did not have the money to maintain the track. So therefore the track got a little bit rough, and the streetcars had a definite rock and roll aspect to them. A lot of clickety-clack as they went down the street.
Dayton's Street Railway Company put the first trolley buses on the streets in April of 1933. The trolleys were introduced to the public with great fanfare. There was even a christening of one of the buses, although the champagne bottle refused to cooperate. Obviously, Daytonians have a long tradition of celebrating when new trolleys roll into town. Dayton fell in love with the new buses. By 1938, all of the city's transit companies were operating trolleys. Through the Depression and World War II, their popularity would skyrocket. It's been estimated that during the war years, up to 70% of Dayton's workforce rode trolleys from home to work and back again. The buses became a necessity.
When I lived on Wildwood Avenue, and that's in Edgemont, very few people on that street had cars. If they did, then they kept them in the garages and I never saw them. But most people, to get back and forth to work or to go downtown, they took a bus.
But the trolleys also meant the days of the streetcar would eventually come to an end. Dayton's last streetcars were taken out of service in 1947. The clickety-clack sound that had filled the air for 59 years was silenced. But for the thousands who still remember them, they'll never be forgotten. If there was one main reason for the demise of the streetcar, it might have been speed. To put it simply, trolleys were fast.
The amazing thing about the trolley bus, up until 1948 or so, it was so fast compared to automobiles. And as I remember, not to give a plug for a particular brand, but the Oldsmobile Rocket 88 was about the first automobile that could out-accelerate a trolley bus. The trolley bus just had tremendous acceleration compared to a streetcar or any normal automobile of the day. And when they started up, they meant business. No one got in the way of a trackless trolley in those days because it was the fastest thing on the street.
I can remember some of those bus drivers really speeding up streets like Wyoming Street, speeding so much, and I was always afraid that a car was going to come out from the side there, you know, and he wouldn't be able to stop in time. But I don't know, he had lots of confidence. He just boom, right up there.
If you were a child in Dayton during the peak of trolley bus popularity, they played a very important role in your life. Being old enough to ride the trolley alone was a true rite of passage.
When you got old enough to where your parents just gave you the money and you got to go by yourself, well, you were really grown up then. And at that time, my grandmother lived across town, and I loved to spend every weekend with my grandmother. So from the time I was about 8 or 9 years old, I would ride the bus by myself to my grandmother's every Friday after school, and then I'd come home on Sunday.
Those who operated Dayton's transit companies were shrewd business people. As far back as the early days of streetcars, they realized profits were made on weekdays. Any revenue generated on weekends, especially Sundays, was a bonus. So, like many other mass transit systems around the country, Dayton's streetcar companies came up with a surefire weekend moneymaker. They built amusement parks. Dayton had several. Maybe you remember spending a day on North Main Street at a place called Frankie's Forest Park. And then there was the place called Fairview. At one time, hundreds, sometimes even thousands, jammed the park on Sundays for this oddity. A trained elk would be led to the top of a platform where it would then dive into a small pond. There's no record as to what it might have cost to actually witness this spectacle. Just around the bend, near Holm and Gettysburg Avenues, was Lakeside Amusement Park, a place of many happy memories for thousands of Daytonians. Lakeside opened in 1890 near what was then called the Old Soldiers' Home. For nearly 75 years, Daytonians would take the streetcar or trolley to Lakeside for a day of excitement and adventure. Today, the site where Lakeside stood is in the path of the new Highway 35 expansion. And despite its decades of existence, we have only a handful of pictures and a few mementos of what Lakeside was really like. But the people remember. Things like a rickety roller coaster, a stately carousel, a fun house, or even a talking mannequin by the name of Laughing Sal. Lakeside is still very much alive.
I can remember all the rides and how much fun we had. I must have gone at least a dozen times with my mother out there. It was just wonderful.
That was the only place that my sister, myself, my sister, and my younger brother, that we were allowed to go without our parents, and that was still Lakeside.
We could spend the whole day out there. You had the haunted house, you had the caterpillar, the carousels, the penny arcade, and $1 went a long way back then. And you could just walk around. It just seemed like it was just the biggest place to go to because it was the only place like that around here at that time.
there was a group of about 3 couples that we kind of ran around together there, and they all wanted to go on this roller coaster. Well, I really hadn't been on a big one, and I thought, look, why not try it? So I did. About halfway through this ride, I was scared to death. And I might have said a little prayer or something, but I told that man upstairs, I said, if I get off of this coaster, I'll never get on another one. So here it is, what, 50 years later, and I still haven't been on one.
During the 1950s, America was becoming prosperous, and there were changes everywhere. When people began to buy and depend on autos, faraway destinations were no longer so distant, and places like Lakeside and Frankie's would gradually fade away. Dayton itself would become something much different. Many would begin to move away from the city. Communities with names like Vandalia, Inglewood, and Kettering would see astonishing growth. Dayton would no longer be a city along the banks of the great Miami River. Now it would be an expanding metropolitan area. Downtown, with its arcade and courthouse and the trolleys that traveled the streets, would never again hold the significance they did for earlier generations. Shops and movie theaters moved into our neighborhoods. We drove to work and then joined hundreds of others in the search for a parking space. In essence, Dayton was growing up. But we still remember. The Dayton of years gone by has become virtually invisible, but not forgotten. So while there's still time, let's take our young people aside and tell them about the Dayton they'll never know. Tell them about the things that made us laugh and smile, about the way we got around, how life was a bit simpler, and maybe safer as well. Make sure to remind the children that memories are something to be cherished and shared. Finally, let's make a promise to stop mourning the passing of the landmarks of our youth and instead celebrate all that has been and realize how fortunate we are that we have memories.